Let me know if you can see the presentation as full screen.
Yes.
Okay. All right, can you just give me a moment? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm usually very quiet, so in case you don't know, I'm Michelle. Hi. Today, I'll be sharing my experience as an undergrad at UC Berkeley in a research fellowship. And this research fellowship is something that I've been working on for past year now. It was supposed to be for summer, but due to COVID, I've worked with them a much longer than just the summer. And if you have any questions at all throughout the presentation, feel free to interrupt me and I'll answer to the best of my ability. But this fellowship is called MERT, just for a little bit of context. You'll see it kind of change a bit throughout the presentation. The official name is Minority Health Global Health Disparities Research Fellowship, but it's actually a training research international fellowship. All right, so I can get started. So the UC Berkeley Minority Health International Research Training Program is funded by the NIH, also known as the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health, if you're not familiar with it, is an agency that is by the nation. They're very much interested in funding all kinds of research at UC Berkeley to discover new things that will help out the population. And they're known for funding UC Berkeley's research. They're one of our biggest funders. And this program is administered by SEND, which is also known as the Henry Wheeler Center for Emerging and Neglected Diseases. This is a department in UC Berkeley as well. And so this program was created with the intention of helping out students at UC Berkeley get exposure to research in different countries, as well as help out these countries itself. It's one of the things that I liked about this program is that not only are the students benefiting from getting exposure into doing research into the fields of interest, but they're also establishing these connections with institutes or little clinics and low-income communities. And it's not just they come in, do their thing and leave. No, they establish these long-lasting connections that remain after they leave, and they keep giving them funds, keep giving them supplies by maintaining this relationship. So it's a more sustainable relationship, and it doesn't leave the people wondering, well, what comes next? And so based off of that, this program did require that those who were in it had to be part of a health disparity population or a minority population. And this is defined as like African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and medically underserved populations from rural areas. I went under Hispanic American. Another thing for this program, there was a requirement to be a part of a 2-unit course called Introduction to Global Health Disparities Research. This course was to prepare us for when we would go to our country of interest. We would learn about our culture, language. We would know all the things that would be necessary to be culturally sensitive, as well as be informed about the population we will be serving. And this class was led by Professor Art Reingold, who is the principal investigator and program director. You can see a photo of him right here. Professor Art Reingold is a renowned researcher in the field. He is the division head of epidemiology at the University of California, Berkeley in the School of Public Health. He worked for 8 years with the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as many low-income countries around the world. He's actually being recruited right now to help out with the pandemic, because he was part of the SARS. I don't know if you remember the SARS pandemic that we had a couple years back before we had COVID, but he was recruited from the Centers for Disease Control for that. So right now he is a very big help for what's going on right now. And so it was an honor to work underneath him. And so a little bit about the country of interest that I worked under. I specifically was supposed to help out in Mysuru, India, or also known as Mysore, India. It's a small town in the state of Karnataka in the southwestern region of Asia. And I was going to be helping out a clinic known as Public Health Research Institute of India, also known as PHRII. This clinic is founded by Purnima Madhivanan, which is the person you can see on the left. She is amazing. She founded this clinic based off the idea of helping out women in that area not only become educated and being able to serve their communities, but they run this clinic. It's fully run by people who are not usually educated. So they didn't get degrees, they didn't go to college, and they're all very well known in the community. So they've established that rapport. They know the people, they know the language, and they were trained in their areas of expertise so that they run this clinic and can help out people without the fear of doctors, as usually within these areas there is. And so I worked with Purnima Madhivanan, who is the founder. And on the middle side, if you see the picture, her name is Anisa. Anisa is the lab research assistant at PHRI. She is one of the community members of that city or town. And then Purnima, she's the third one on the right. She is the administrator, HR, and finance officer. She was a huge help in all of the bureaucracies and logistics that had to be done in figuring out how to have me go over there, what needs to be done, who is going to be my translator, because I did not know Kannada. I don't know Kannada at all. But she was going to help me figure out that language barrier. And there was a whole transfer of having Anisa in the middle. She came to UC Berkeley and I helped her out for a bit, and kind of like the lab we have at UC Berkeley. I trained her a bit in some of the things in the labs that we had and gave her tours and just answered any questions she had. And in return, she was just more than welcome to help me out once I went to India. And that's a little bit about PHRI, because that's the main clinic I would be at. I would stay at their place. And this was before COVID, by the way. I keep saying past tense because these are plans I had before COVID hit. So before COVID hit, the main study I was going to be working is the Meridil study. This is a cohort that they've been working with since 6 years now. So the main interest that I had in this city and this program in general was that they were interested in looking at people in places called slums or shanty towns. These are low-income community people who are known with having lots of heart problems or cardiovascular disease. And the main interest was to see if there was a link between cardiovascular disease and mental health. There is a huge mental health problem in India. They're known for their high suicide rates, and it's one of the biggest public health problems they have at India, besides cardiovascular disease. And so this study is trying to link whether cardiovascular disease has anything to do with bad mental health or vice versa. Does one affect the other? And so I was going to be working with Dr. Carl Krupp and his colleagues and working with the Meridil cohort. We were supposed to follow up with 600 to 700 Indian women and see how they have been since the last time they worked with them, which was 2 years ago. We wanted to see if the previous time that they were followed up with, they were given recommendations on how they could follow up on their care, their health. They were looked at by a clinic doctor and they were given instructions on what they could do based off of what their state was at the time. But like any low-income community, there's always problems of accessibility, there's problems of transportation, resources. So we expected quite a bit of different results. So that was going to be the Meridil study for the summer of 2020. Our central hypothesis was older Indian women residing in these urban slums would have a high risk for cardiovascular disease due to low cardiovascular disease risk factor knowledge. So the lack of knowledge about cardiovascular disease would affect their health outcome. And that was just a metric that we had because it's really hard to measure mental health based off of a metric. It's all about how do we want to measure a certain aspect of the study, and this was the best way we could at the time. And one of the biggest things that I learned in this fellowship is all of the many things that you have to do to be in a research study to begin with. So this study, because it is working with people, it goes under human subject research. It is purely observational. There's no experimentation being done, but because there's always a risk that comes with working with people, there's always some potential harms. There is a lot of certifications that need to get done by every single person a part of the study. And I thought I would let you guys all know, like I have the little pictures here so you can see what certifications, what does that look like? What kind of things do you have to do? So like they have like a passing score, you would go through these slides, you would go through these demonstrations of possible scenarios that you might come across. And basically, I had to learn all the things that have been done in the past in the name of research and what's ethical, non-ethical, all in the name of making sure that the past does not get repeated and that we understand where we are today in terms of public health and what's okay, what's not okay internationally versus domestically. There's so much legal jargon that I learned. I was very confused. I was not well versed in anything research. It's one of the big reasons why I was part of this program. It was my first exposure into research, and it was my first exposure into working with another country, another population, many different cultures under just one population. And then another thing besides the certifications, there's also the IRB. So UC Berkeley has their own IRB, International Review Board. They're known for looking at all different research projects under different principal investigators. You must have a professor on top of just basically someone vouching that they will be mentoring and observing in everything you do, making sure that undergraduate students aren't just doing projects on their own. And even then, the International Review Board, they will review all the materials that you'll be using, the methods you will be following, as well as you have to have a whole background report as to what is the research that's already out there, what are the holes in research you're trying to address, and why is your research even necessary? Is it causing more harms than benefits? And if so, they will just deny you. They will tell you, I'm sorry, but no, you're not going to get this done. And if they see potential in your research, they will send it back and they'll say, okay, well, you can make some adjustments and send it back and we'll reconvene and see. And there's just so much more logistics than what I'm saying. I am basically just summarizing. But there's a whole lot of like, let's say this is very urgent. For example, COVID. There was a lot of research done for COVID. I know that. Let's say you need to expedite this research project because suddenly you need to make sure that the vaccine, because it's more experimental, you need to make sure the vaccine is not hurting a certain population. So you send this to the IRB and you tell the IRB, this is urgent and we need to get this done quick. It's not a whole council or a whole community that's going to be looking at it. It's going to be specific people that are more, how do I put it, more professional, more on top of their field, and it will be done in a certain amount of days. But it's even more intensely looked at because it's in such a short time period. Mine wasn't that urgent, so it was done within a matter of months. And then the part that I didn't realize is that not only did I have to go through UC Berkeley's IRB, I also had to go through the IRB in India. So there's two IRBs, the one at UC Berkeley in the United States, and there's the one in India. They both have to give the okay. If one says no, the whole thing just gets scrapped. Luckily enough, this project, since it's already been in the works and is more of a follow-up, they already have that established relationship with the IRB and they already knew what to expect. They already had this document filled out, as you can see the one on the left. It was basically already filled out from the previous cohort. We just basically had to adjust our hypothesis as well as the methods that we're going to be doing for this upcoming research project. And it was very interesting understanding what language had to be used. very formal, very concise, no details could be left out. And it's all in just one document, trying to do a whole research project in one document and try to get as much possible so that it's very transparent as to what you're going to be doing, as well as making sure that the materials were translated in the language that's going to be given to the people, because they need to make sure that the people are going to be properly informed and that there's nothing going to be changed. If there's ever any changes made in a research study, it has to be reported immediately to the IRB, and it could potentially even mean they have to review it all over again. So all of this was very new to me. And then, okay, so I think for the purposes of the rest of the presentation, I wanted to show you the kind of materials that I created, but I'm going to give you a little bit of context between the jump of last summer to this summer, because then you'll understand why the materials are completely different than what I just explained. So I was going to be a coordinator for the study that I mentioned previously. However, due to the situation of the pandemic, that all changed and I was no longer going to be working on the study. That study was actually paused. Everything was paused. All of the studies that were going to be done in this training program, there was like Brazil, India, China, Nicaragua, all these other locations, they were all paused because of the pandemic. And we had to talk to our mentors, and they established we would not be traveling abroad. The situations were too dire. And instead, we were going to work remotely and see if we could contribute our experience and skills for the pandemic, because it was now damage control. And that changed my entire experience, because it now became an evolving situation from last year to this year. And it was more of an all hands on deck situation. So from just helping out Mysore, India, it became, how do we help out all of India? We are now looking at it as a whole country, not just a city or a town. And how could we use my skills as someone who knows how to work with people in outreach? I love talking to people, and I love making science digestible and easy to understand, because my biggest thing is I want people to be able to see the work that's being done in the name of humanity and all that's good. I don't believe in science benefiting from people. I believe that people should be able to get a say in all that's being done. And that's community participatory research. That's my field of interest. And so in this pandemic, my role was to be part of a new study. And this study, there's not even the title for it. I haven't heard all of the information yet as to what's going on with it. Everything's just kind of chaotic in terms of what's going on. I'm still kind of trying to get in contact with the people as to what's happened. Like, did the research materials receive well? Are they having problems translating it? I still need to connect with them to find out. But so these materials were going to be used by PHRI. They were getting community members that were working in that clinic, and they were going to train them to go house to house with these outreach materials and inform the population there on how to treat themselves for COVID. And I say treat themselves because the situation in India was evolving so quickly since last summer that they quickly became overrun with COVID. There were no hospital beds, and the doctors were desperate. They were desperate for some solution. And so PHRI said, well, we have resources from Berkeley. How can we use those resources? And there's researchers and institutions all around India that have similar connections with different universities. And they said the same thing, how could we all help? And so they created this whole group, India COVID SOS. And there's a group chat I'm in now. Yeah, I can see group chat. It's really interesting. They're all providing research materials. They do webinars. They are constantly in contact with all parts of India. And so my part was to create these outreach materials for the people in PHRI. And what they needed was one, an informed consent, a document, so that the people who are getting the help or receiving the help in homes, they would give the consent that they would be helped by people who are being trained and not necessarily medically trained. And that was the biggest difficulty for me to understand, is how are we playing this line of ethics? Because me, myself, I am not no licensed medical individual whatsoever. I was constantly afraid that something I would say or write or do could potentially affect someone in a negative way. And luckily enough, I had enough people on the team tell me, well, this was going to be looked at by medical individuals. It was going to have its own review by many, many, many people before it actually touches the people. So just a fair warning, the materials you're going to see, it's very rough. And I'm pretty sure it's been changed multiple times since I've sent it out. It was more of a, they wanted me to look at all the things that were being put out by India, put it all together in a way that's digestible by people in rural areas and urban areas, and make it in a way that if people can't read, they can understand just by looking at the picture. And another thing is we had to be very careful of what we said, because the situation was constantly evolving. Everyone took everything to heart. So if we say, oh, we need you to quarantine for 3 days before you can see someone if you've been coughing, suddenly we realized 2 months later, oh my gosh, it's 10 days actually. You're infectious for 10 days. So now we tell the public, scratch that, we need you to stay home for 10 days. The people are going to be confused. The people are going to be angry, and they're going to be like, well, why did you say 3? You said that before, and now I have family that's sick. You lose rapport, you lose confidence, and people start to panic. People start to doubt in your capabilities as public health, as anybody really, because there's teachers, there's educators, there's researchers. It's everybody really that's helping out. So to get the people to understand where we're coming from, we have to make sure we're using language that is easy to understand, that is, how would I put it, that can be changed. Something that's not very finite and say, well, this is how it is, because it's not. It's constantly changing. We're constantly learning as we go. And so you can see the informed consent form that I have right here. I put a little bit of pictures so you can see what we came up with. And then this is a little brochure that we were going to give out to people home to home. It was supposed to be small, supposed to be more pictures than anything. Another thing that I was a little bit shocked is that people were just giving out graphics left and right. So when we're trying to create infographics, my biggest thing as an undergrad was like, oh, I need to source it all. I need to make sure that they know where I got my source from. I don't know if it's because the situation was dire, or because at the end of the day, like, people all over India were just like, just use it. If it's helping people, just use it. I don't know if it's copyright or fair use. I'm not very like into the legal aspects of it, but they said don't source it, just use it. You have permission from everyone to just do it. So that was basically where I got the photos from. They're from different organizations in India. Another thing was how many times they would send it back and say, this looks foreign, you need to change it. This isn't something that they will relate to or understand because this looks very American. So my Western knowledge was coming out in the way I was writing. It was coming out in the way I was presenting information or pictures. There's a lot of pictures that represent Americans, but not a lot of pictures that represent Indians or people of color, or in general, the cultures, the dress. You can see it in the way that they put down PPE that's not available in India. They'll have it for their labs or scientists. Like the one picture in the middle at the top, like even that seemed like it was still kind of foreign because they had more PPE than you would see someone walking around with in India. And yeah, so there was a lot of going back and forth through emails, just getting a lot of feedback from people. And I'm pretty sure, like I said, they changed so much more since I've last sent this. But yeah, this was mostly for people with mild COVID symptoms, not severe. If it was severe in any way, it was always suggested that they try to go to a hospital or contact a provider. because at the end of the day, they should probably go see someone if they're struggling really badly with anything really. But another thing I was also kind of confused and also interested in was what metrics they had for what's considered severe, what's considered mild. So all of these things were going to be used by the people. And there was a questionnaire that we had to create that we were going to send to the people, and they had to fill out. And it was going to say, well, have you proned if you can't breathe? How long have you been proning? What sides have you been using? And based off of their responses, it would mean whether the doctor would look at you or not, because they're just that overwhelmed. And if, let's say, people say, well, I haven't been proning, but I have been trying to like be on my side or something, and some version of proning, but it's not really proning, or they've not done enough proning and they put that down on the paper, this would be sent out to a doctor. They collect all of these questionnaires from the little town, and the doctor would look at each and every one, just looking at the responses and saying to the PHRI members, like, hey, this person needs to prone more. I'm not going to see them because we don't have the resources for it, but let them know they need to do 10 more minutes of this. And if it doesn't get better, change the response and tell me why. The whole point of the program was to be more efficient with how the doctors would help the people so that they wouldn't overrun the hospitals. And so that was the brochure for the people. And then this one was a little bit more trickier because it was an informational guide that was going to be given to the community members that were going house to house. So it's not only how can we treat those who are in the houses, how can we teach them to treat themselves, but how can we protect the community members going into those houses? What do they need to know to protect themselves as well as educate the ones who are in their home? So it became, so how do they do infection control at home? What PPE should they be using? How to dispose of the PPE? And I realized there's a lot of differences in how we treat our garbage in here in the United States versus India. And that had to be laid out. I will show you slide by slide what this information guide, it's supposed to be more extensive, and I'm sure they added more because there's just so much more that's probably been put out since I last made this. But in general, all of it's done with the intention that it's supposed to be a more, how do I put this? It's a guide that's supposed to be used by people all over India, but it is not strict. It could be adapted, it can be changed, because at the end of the day, it might not fit the population of interest. Again, it depends on the resources available. Again, like I remember I mentioned this another day, but in case no one remembers, pulse oximeters, they're in every household now in India because of the last wave that hit them. The state was giving them all pulse oximeters because they realized that people need to be able to tell what their oxygen levels are. If they don't know what their oxygen levels are, then it makes it harder for hospitals, makes it hard for physicians to know who needs to stay home and who needs to be in the hospital. That's something we don't really have in the US. Unless you go to the pharmacy and buy it yourself, it's like $30. So I didn't realize I need to put this down until Anissa told me that that's something in every standard Indian household now. And there's also like the type of disinfectants they use. They're telling me all these names I've never heard of before. They were using certain medications that we don't have here, but in India, it's like ibuprofen, it's like Tylenol, it's standard painkillers. And there's also that there's different cultures, so certain things won't be used. More spiritual people wouldn't want to use certain things. They rather do their own methods. So you have to figure out a way to present that information in a way that's respectful, as well as just trying to help them if they need it. And so I will continue with the slides so you can see what the information guide looks like. Yeah, and I can't help but looking at this now, I'm sure that some of this information is outdated, and they might have made it even a little bit more stricter as to when to discontinue home isolation. Because as you can see, like this document was from June. a lot has changed since June. And then just for reference as to where all this information came from, I always made sure that I had that down. So in case if they're going to be changing the information or updating it, they know which website to go to and refer to. At the end of the day, we needed to make sure that our information came from credible sources, because we need to be able to show the public, well, this is where it came from. We wanted to dispel misinformation, not create misinformation. We wanted to make sure that during this pandemic, we could be confided in, that they could be confident that we would give them the most updated information and that we could pinpoint where we got it from. So that was one of the biggest things too for this program. And since then that I've turned in all of these materials, I've been in contact with them and they'll just be telling me like, what's the situation in India? And I haven't heard from them in a month. And that seems like a long time, but there'll be times where they will go silent because there's things going on the ground that I have no idea what's going on. Because it's also another thing I've noticed in the United States, we could be going through our own things that have to do with weather or the climate. But in India, they could be going through more things. They could be going through another COVID surge. They could be going through another COVID symptom that wasn't really a problem here. Like I learned about COVID tongue, COVID toe, which is basically your skin turning black and it looks like a mold of sorts. Never heard of that symptom here, but it's something that happens over there. But yeah, that's just a bit of like the different things that I experienced in India. And it was a remote experience. It wasn't an in-person experience. But at the end of the day, I learned so much from the people that I worked with, people that I met with online. And I also do want to keep in contact with them to see what happens, what's the evolving situation with the pandemic. And that's my experience. You're more than welcome to ask me any questions on any of the slides if you have any.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience.
Cool. Do we have any questions for Michelle?
I've got a question. Michelle, you mentioned that your original study was paused or shelved because of COVID. Are there any plans to continue with that study? And if so, would it be adapted? Because I'm sure there are a lot of mental health problems that have resulted from COVID and everything people have experienced and witnessed. So I guess my question is the original study going to continue? And if so, is it going to change at all?
No, yeah, thanks for your question. This is a question I've asked myself actually, and I've mentioned to the program director, Dr. Marivan, also known as Purnima. And she did mention that right now everything is COVID focused. And in general, in the field of public health, what I've noticed is that everyone's putting aside all these public health issues and making COVID their main focus because it's the most, how do I put it, the most intense, relevant thing that's going on right now. And are there cons to this? Yes, very much so. We're seeing surges, as like you said, mental health was an issue already in India before COVID. It's probably been worse now, and it's due to different reasons that have COVID related sources. But the problems that were originally there never went away. They're still there, and some of them are actually getting worse because they're being put to the side. So I'm pretty sure they will continue this study after they can get control of COVID. Because I know like in India, they've been one of the countries that have been hit the hardest by COVID. And it's always been, what can you help the people with that they need the most? That's another thing that I noticed about UC Berkeley that I appreciate, that they ask the people, what do you need help with the most? Not what do we want to help you with, because sometimes researchers go at that angle of, well, I'm interested in cardiovascular disease and we want to do research on cardiovascular disease. Might not be their biggest problem, but it's the one that we're interested in. No, we actually asked them, what's your biggest issue and can we help? And so to answer your question and not get sidetracked, I'm pretty sure they're going to continue this study once they get control of COVID, and they might even adapt it because, like you said, COVID has affected a lot of people in many ways, and mental health is one of them. I could potentially see them creating another research study that's just focused on COVID and its effects on the mental health, as well as cardiovascular disease, because again, like they have huge issues with heart problems in that particular area. So I definitely see them continuing or adapting it or just creating a whole new study based off of that.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else have any questions?
I have a question, and thank you for the presentation. And I was just wondering, since you are working remotely out here in California, were there any issues between time zones working with people on the ground over in India and just having to relay that information?
Yes, there actually, it was very interesting. I wouldn't say it's much of a problem. It just changed my mode of working. So I was known for working at, let's say, like 11 a.m., 12 p.m., 1 p.m. That changed because there's a 12-hour difference between here in California and in Mysore, India. And not just that, but the way the clinic runs, they run throughout the day. So all the members have to get all the things they need to get done then. And they run their Zoom meetings because, again, that's where everything changed. Everything became Zoom. So they had their Zoom meetings in the afternoon. So what best worked with the program director, the members there, was working around 9 p.m., 10 p.m. at night. For me, that's 6, 7 in the morning. So my meetings with them would run at like 6 in the morning, and I had to be ready. They were getting ready to sleep and I was barely getting up in the morning. Really interesting. But that's literally the only slight problem, because there were times where things would get late for them. They had a very busy day. COVID really got them that day. And so they would tell me, like, how can we reschedule? And it became a game of when are we available? Because 12-hour difference is pretty big. But I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this Zoom meeting can relate to that problem of trying to figure out what time is available for them.
All right, thanks for answering the question.
I guess on my side, you said when you were writing up your stuff, you had like you found some cultural difference where it wouldn't be accepted in India. Aside from photos, was there any other like major, like, I guess, culture shock instances, kind of like that may have occurred when you're writing up the report?
Definitely. I would definitely say there was my way of thinking. I remember in some of the webinars that we would have with other people, I would find myself being more quiet than talking most of the time, because I realized the perspectives that they were coming from were completely different from my own or those from the Western world. I had to change my way of thinking and how I approach certain topics and subjects, because I'm privileged. We're very privileged in what we have, and what India has or doesn't have is completely different, just due to the fact that they are considered a third world country. I think they're very rich in many areas, and culture being one of them. But in certain aspects like resources, we are definitely privileged. And coming from that perspective, I had to make sure that I was listening more than talking and asking more questions than anything, I was definitely humbled, and I'm still very, very grateful that I've had the opportunity to learn from them and realize my privilege and how I could use my privilege to help others. So yeah, it was very much a learning experience in just how I thought, how I talked, and what I could provide. How could I help? And I think that most of the Western world would benefit from learning from other countries more than us trying to tell people what they need to do or what are the ways of health. I do believe that the Western world thinks that we are the top in everything, but sometimes we're not. And it's okay to say that, hey, we can learn from others. So it was definitely a learning experience for me.
Cool. Excellent insight. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Hey, Michelle, this is Frank. Thanks so much for your presentation. So I just have one question. In terms of their self-awareness for mental issues, is that something that's easily talked about in a traditional culture in India, or is that something that you need to bring up?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Actually, it brings up something that I actually spoke about with my own family because I could relate. I would say that their culture doesn't know how to use certain terms that in America we've already defined and well established in psychology or in mental health. For example, let's say, oh, this person is feeling a bit sad. They would even be clinically described as depressed. In India, they don't have that term. They don't have that definition. Instead, let's say the child hasn't been doing homework, hasn't been doing well in school, and is constantly crying. The parents would say, you're thinking too much, stop thinking, or you're not working hard enough. You need to keep yourself busy. They wouldn't say the child's sad, they wouldn't say the child is depressed because it's not something well talked about in their culture, nor is it something established as a social norm. And I can relate to this because in Mexican culture, we don't really talk about depression. We don't really talk about sadness. It's always about, like, for example, my father would tell my little brothers, oh, you're sad, you're thinking too much. You need to go do things. You need to go out. But it's never just talked about the terminology. And so coming from that perspective, it goes back to how do you go about doing a study on mental health with a population that doesn't really talk about mental health, nor has the definition of mental health? How would you measure that using what we know, but also wanting to adapt it so it's relevant for them?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I did some work on climate adaptation several years ago, and one of the issues that brought up was you look at places like Vietnam, like rural Vietnam, or some of these small island countries, and the issue came up was, from a Western perspective, it seemed like these people were suffering from severe mental stress, but then the discussion was, should we even be trying to um, look at this from a Western perspective of mental health? The problem is these people lose everything, right? The floods come in and they lose everything. But for the most part, they were fairly resilient. They always found a way to have their communities come back together. And so, I think the conclusion was, as Westerners, we should not be judging them on whether they're mentally healthy. If they seem they're happy and they're getting by, then we should support them in that way. Because I think the prevailing notion until then was, oh, okay, we should send therapists, which apparently is really a bad idea.
Actually, Frank, I have a follow up on your point. For given you guys can hear me?
Mm-hmm. We can hear you.
Good. Given that, look, mental health is a scientific theory. It's not a fact. It's a theory that some people in this country have constructed. Given that other countries don't recognize it, how do we know that it's real or useful? If you don't, I mean, when I was growing up, we had the exact same attitude that if you said you were depressed, you know, you might get hit. The whole idea of being depressed was ridiculous. The idea of you ever say you were depressed, that was completely unacceptable. And then so how do we know? How do we know if they don't accept it as something which is valid? How do we know it's real?
That's a very valid point and an interesting perspective that many people would agree with you. And it's been talked about widely. It's not very much disputed because most of the time when research is being done, it's done by the Western perspective. And this Western perspective says, well, yeah, we should worry about mental health because we defined it as such and such.
It's done by the Western academic perspective. I think people in academics believe that. People who aren't in academics don't necessarily subscribe to that.
I would agree.
So I'm just, I mean it as a real thing. Like, look, what are the signatures that are, when you're there and you're working with these people, what part of it, I mean, certainly if someone kills themselves, you would assume that they were depressed. I mean, but you don't want to wait until that happens to try to identify it. And I was just curious from your perspective, working with people who don't recognize depression as a valid category, when does it come in? Like, when does it become subjective to objective?
I would definitely say that from my perspective, when I start looking at mental health and bringing it in, saying like, okay, I'm gonna go at it from this perspective, is when I realize I see a trend. What's the result and what is the source of it? I think that's the biggest thing that even now I'm still trying to understand is, well, the result is, let's say, suicide. There's going to be many, many risk factors that can contribute to suicide, and trying to figure out what the source of it, that's the most difficult thing to do. So you kind of try to narrow it down. And let's say for Mysore, India, they've tried to narrow it down to mental health. Could we be looking at it wrong and looking at the wrong thing and defining it wrong? We really can. It's happened before where we say, for example, disease, we'll say people are getting sick. It must have to do with the smell. It might have to do with what you're touching or what you're doing, but you might be looking at it completely wrong. And it's actually microbes. It's because you're touching things that are infected. But how do you know that? You kind of learn with time. And so right now we're looking at it through mental health lens, the Western academic lens. That might change in a couple of years because we might learn down the line from others, which is why I completely agree. We should always listen from other perspectives and not just look at it from the Western view, because we might be narrowing our lens down and completely losing sight of other points of view that could potentially add to this field and benefit more people. I see what you're talking about. Does that answer your question a little bit, Charles?
A little bit. I mean, look, clearly, if someone commits suicide, we would say that they have a mental health issue, although there are cultures where suicide is acceptable. In our culture, it's not. In fact, but I mean, that's at some point there you would expect there'd be a crossover between. I mean, I could take sort of I should say Carl's perspective that some of these things exist because the drug companies want them, right? Like we want to sell people drugs to cure mental health, so we tell them they have mental health problems. There's a financial incentive to do it. If there's no financial incentive to diagnose people with mental health issues, or I should say the financial incentive biases the diagnosis. So it's difficult to know if the diagnosis is unbiased or not because of the tremendous financial incentives around it. And I was just wondering, from you're in a society where those financial incentives don't exist, is there did you recognize some clear demarcation between, look, people just have life's just unfortunate, just how it is, you're stuck in a bad situation, as opposed to you actually have something neurochemically wrong in your brain, which is going to cause you to commit self-harm or some other thing. And I was just curious if there was if you had any insight into where that boundary was.
Yeah, it's one of the most incredibly frustrating things, I would say, from my perspective, is trying to figure out how much of it is being influenced by, like you said, pharmaceuticals, how much of it is being done so that people can profit off of people being mentally ill, like you say. Because I know, like, there's a manual, I'm trying to remember, it's called the DSM, but I don't remember what the actual acronym means. But the DSM manual is constantly being changed, and the symptoms are constantly being redefined. And like you said, people are being, how would you put it? They are being treated based off of this DSM manual that's used by physicians. Some people are being misdiagnosed. And because they're being misdiagnosed, they're probably not getting the treatment they need. Or like you said, how do you know they need that treatment to begin with? People that, like back when women they had a mental health illness, they were called crazy. They were put in asylums, and the harms that came from it were tremendous. Later on, they realized, or later on, they defined saying, oh, actually, some of them had schizophrenia. Oh, hey, some of them had this. But in the end of the day, because we did not define it then, there was a lot of harm that came from it. But today we might be causing harm because we still haven't changed that definition. It all comes back to, what do we know now? And that's my biggest thing in public health, that I realized that everything is constantly evolving. The information is based off of what we know and what we have access to. For example, COVID, there's a lot of harm that was done in the beginning because we didn't know anything. We were just trying so hard to minimize the deaths, minimize the spread of infection, that we were trying so hard to tell the public, don't do this, do that. Some people were like, well, why do I even need to wear a mask? You don't even know what you're doing. You're learning. They're doing the best they can. At the end of the day, it all comes with the intent and purpose at hand, and trying to use all the knowledge that you have at your disposal. And it also comes back to the IRB. It always comes back to the IRB. The processes they have available, the regulations that we have, is all done in the name of minimizing the harm done. Do the benefits outweigh the cons? And usually they will always say it has to benefit more. There should be no cons. Even a little bit of con is scrutinized, because they're like, well, if people are getting hurt, should we even be doing this at all? The vaccination, for example, how many people are getting hurt when we're doing these trials? If there's even 1%, that 1% they scrutinize, like, should we even risk the 1%? Well, lots of people are dying. Millions, billions of people are dying. So maybe that 1% is worth it. And this is just theoretical, hypothetical, if you will. I'm just kind of giving you an example. But I definitely see your point, where you have to look at it from all perspectives, because if you look at it from one, you're missing the whole point entirely. Maybe. There's a lot of maybes in all of this, I would say. But some of it, I would say there is fact. Because if it leads to death, then yeah, you got to find a way to look at the science that we have today. Sometimes science, we get it right. Sometimes we get it right. And sometimes we're redefining because something new is discovered. Science is ever evolving. It's never just a fact, is what I've realized.
Okay, so I did a quick look up right now. So the suicide rate in the US per 100,000 is 13, and then in India it's 10, and in Mexico it's 5. So, well, just for food of thought, it may or may not say anything, right? But, and then the other point is that, at the Anthropocene, we do talk a lot about air pollution and how it shortens people's lives. But then, there's been several studies showing that that's actually probably not the most important thing in terms of your lifespan. And there's a very well-known Harvard study that shows that the most important factor, how long you live, is how many meaningful connections you have in your life, in your life. And so when you look at some of these traditional cultures where community is much stronger and the collective is more important than the individuality, you see that, I don't know if that necessarily correlates to suicide rate or not, but even though they may not live in the most safe conditions, as communities, they seem to be more resilient. So that's my last point that I wanted to make today.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, that just
I-
goes back to my, oh, sorry,
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
go for
Please
it.
go ahead.
Are you sure?
Okay, all right. Yes, well, great talk and great after discussion. I believe in your talk, you mentioned that you've always been very into public outreach. And I was wondering where that came from for you.
Yeah. So I'm currently in Stockton, California. I was born and raised here. Stockton is known for its high crime rates and one of the most underserved communities in all of California, besides Oakland and some other ones. We have one of the worst air problems here in part of the Central Valley. In general, they have the worst air. And here we have homicide, genocide rates that are bigger than the national average. And as well as there's a lot of mistrust in the health community here. And so growing up, I would be exposed to all the public health problems that I consider normal. And it honestly gives me the perspective that I'm trying to help other communities as to what is considered their normal, and is that normal? Should it even be disrupted? Would it cause more harm to even like get involved? That comes from my own background, because here in Stockton, hearing gunshots at night, that's my normal. And I wouldn't even flinch, because for me, it's just kind of like, that's the realities. People getting hurt, that's my normal too. Traffic accidents. For example, I live next to a high school. We don't have sidewalks. So there's constantly children being hit by cars. Did they change this? No, they just gave us lanyards so that we would be able to be identified if we were to get hit. That was my experience in high school. They told us we need to keep our lanyards in case something happens to us so that they can identify us, instead of changing the more the structure problem that was happening there, which is, why don't we just add sidewalks? Why don't we add a stop sign? These public health issues that I wasn't really informed about, nor I don't even know what public health was before college. So when I started doing outreach as a teenager, it was more of volunteer work. How can I make my city look more beautiful? I've noticed the graffiti. I noticed no kids wanted to go play in the playgrounds because they were scared to. I could never play outside my house because it's too dangerous. And as a teenager, I just wanted something different. And I knew that there was a lot of my peers who felt the same way. And to this day, I noticed my community is still trying their best to change the narrative for our town, our city. And I know there's many more communities out there who feel the same way, or are experiencing that sense of something's not right, but we don't know what it is. And so that's my background in outreach, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Mhm. If no one has any more questions.
All right. This has been a very lively discussion. Great presentation, Michelle. Very, very impressed.
Thank you.